Go ahead.
Hey, thank you, Robert. As Zoom Master, I do appreciate that, and the work you've put in on Zoom mastering in recent times. Well, a warm welcome to all the AHSM members in Victoria, and in addition, of course, to Queensland and New South Wales, and I believe we've also got members from the Northern Territory and Tasmania, of course, tonight. A reminder that we have a special event coming up Wednesday of next week. This is the 23rd, and it'll be our first Zoom AGM. So, as I say, please Zoom in. The main event, of course, is to have our Vice President, Mr. Derek Buckmaster, and his presentation tonight. The Wirraway newspaper wars is our discussion tonight, and I trust everyone will enjoy. And we've got more than 50 members viewing at present time. Derek, of course, is well known for his subject of writing his book on the series. There's a bit of a free advert there for Derek. I'll put over the top. So if you haven't got a copy, you're missing out. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker, Derek Buckmaster, our Vice President, and of course the author of the series and tonight's presentation, The Wirraway Newspaper Wars. Derek, over to you.
Thank you, Dave. And I'm just going to share my screen now. And hopefully everyone can see that.
Got it.
And I'll go to presentation mode and hopefully everyone can see that.
Yes.
Excellent. So tonight, I guess as some of you know, I'm currently researching and writing a manuscript for a book about the Wirraway. And this has been a long-term project. Many of you will know that this has been happening for over 5 years. I feel a little bit like the travails that Phil Varbre is going through with his book. Although he might be a bit closer than I am with mine. But there's a lot of fascinating aspects of the Wirraway. So the Wirraway, of course, was the first military aircraft built in large numbers in Australia before the Second World War. And there's a lot of fascinating aspects to it that have come to light as I've done this research. One of the more curious aspects, though, was an interesting battle that arose in the newspapers. The newspapers, of course, and the radio were the two media of the day. There was no internet, no TV. And the newspapers really held the sway in affecting public opinion. So I came across some of these newspaper articles and it caused me to look into this in a little more detail to understand the context and what was going on. And I put this together in a presentation that I gave a couple of years ago at one of the conferences up in Sydney. It was, I think, 3 years ago now. So anyway, this is going to be an overview of the media battle following the choice of an American aircraft for the RAAF at a time when Australia still looked towards the home country, i.e. England. So I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you're as fascinated as I was by the story. It's not so much a story about aeroplanes, it's a story about politics. And I think we all know that when it comes to military aeroplanes, there's no flying without politics. So off we go. In 1936, in March 1936, a mission of 3 experts were sent overseas by the Aviation Syndicate. And they came back and they recommended the choice of the North American NA-19 for local manufacture. And the reason that they chose this aircraft was to fulfill an RAAF need for a general purpose aircraft. And that's a picture of an NA-19 aircraft known in the US Army Air Corps as the BT-9. The decision was somewhat controversial. Now, why was it controversial? Well, first of all, it was not a British designed aircraft. It was an American design. And the Prime Minister of the time, Joseph Lyons, had actually promised that a British aircraft would be built in his earlier negotiations with the Dominions Office and the UK Prime Minister. Now, if you want to learn about some of those discussions that Prime Minister Lyons had with the UK, you can listen in on October 2nd, when I've got an invitation to speak to the Friends of the Air Force History and Heritage Group, and so I'll be doing a talk about the politics of the Wirraway. So anyway, it wasn't a British design, and Lyons had promised the British that he would build a British design. The second reason it was controversial was it diverged away from the common equipment policy, which had been agreed upon in the 1923 Imperial Conference. Now, the Air Force and the Air Board and the Department of Defence actually had good reason to diverge from this common equipment policy. And there were interesting clauses in the common equipment policy that enabled them to choose different aircraft to the RAF, because several of the other dominions had already done that. And it would not be the first case that Australia moved away from a non-common aircraft. Another reason the decision was controversial was that the selection process didn't follow the normal process, which was driven by the imperial contacts. The CAC had formed a syndicate had formed before CAC, and they went overseas and actually talked directly to the aircraft companies in England, and they talked with aircraft companies in Europe, and they talked with aircraft companies in the US, and that was incredibly controversial, because the process that they were supposed to follow was that the RAAF would create a specification that would be communicated to the air liaison in the Air Ministry, and the air liaison would then talk to the Air Ministry. The Air Ministry would talk to British manufacturers. They would choose a design, feed it back to the air liaison. The air liaison would talk back to the Air Board, and the RAAF would be told what was coming. So that was the normal process. The process that the consortium chose was totally different from that. They drove it themselves. So there was a lot of controversy about this decision. And that followed a lot of controversy about the inclusion of an American company in the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation ownership. And that again is part of the politics. That's round two of the politics. So it's a controversial decision. And of course, it hit the newspapers. It was big news. And here's the Sun in Melbourne on 10th of January 37, announcing that Australia is going to build 212-mile-per-hour fighting planes. It's an American design for long-range flight conditions, and there are going to be jobs for 700 workmen at Fisherman's Bend. Faster than any aeroplane in Australia are the American trainer fighters to be built here under license. They're really talking it up. This was a big thing. And of course, there's a picture of the NA-16 trainer, which was about the only picture that they had at the time. And I think that was purloined out of Jane's All the World's Book of Aircraft. More headlines. When one of the sample aircraft arrived to do flight tests, the NA-16 or the NA-32, here it is, photographed front page on the Sun, October the 2nd. Australia's new 300-mile-per-hour warplane. That's interesting. I thought it was a 212-mile-per-hour warplane. So we're getting the whole thing built up. I guess it's 300 in a dive. So we got a lot of positive spin from some of the newspapers. Mind you, not all of the newspapers were positive. So here's the Advertiser in Adelaide in January 37. Type of plane ordered will be obsolete in 1935. Experts' criticism and developments in Britain declaring that the NA-16 American type of aircraft was regarded as obsolete in 1935. A leading aviation expert said yesterday that he was astonished that the Defence Department had placed an order for this type of plane. Now we're going to hear about that expert that they were quoting. He was Charles Grey, and I'll talk a little bit more about CG Grey later on. And another headline, not so positive either, Royal or American. Is it impossible that the explanation, it is impossible that the explanation for the reason for the Commonwealth government's contract with the Commonwealth Aircraft to build American aircraft can be allowed to remain at the point now reached. So the Sydney Morning Herald is being very critical. They're questioning the patriotism or the commitment to the royal family and commitment to the empire by the people who are behind this abomination of an American aeroplane. So there's some fascinating stuff going on. And I as I read all of these articles, was very interested, but I wanted to dig into it a little more as I wrote my book, so that I could understand the context and understand exactly what was going on. So I did a bit of digging, worked through Trove, worked through articles from June 36 to April 39, dug out about 860 articles. I was working only on the Capital City Daily newspaper articles. There were, of course, many regional newspapers that were repeating the same information. And I'll get back to that later on as well. I grouped all of these 860 articles into 24 different tags by the event that you can see here on the right-hand side. And then I categorized the articles whether they were supportive, highly supportive, neutral, or negative towards the decision. So you can see the biggest number of articles was around a strike by the Australian Engineers Union at the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory between July and September in 1938. There was a lot of industrial action that went on for several months, and of course that picked up a lot of articles because it was an event that took so long to take place. The next largest number of articles by these categories was the fact of choosing an American aircraft design, and then followed by the construction of the CAC factory, the rollout of the first Wirraway, and then production of the Wirraways. So they're the top 5 groups of articles that appeared in my searches. Now, what did all of this look like in terms of timing? So as I said, we're looking at the period between June 1936 and the first flight. And June 1936 was when the Defence Minister, Archdale Parkhill, announces that an aircraft factory is going to be created. That's June 36, and we follow the timeline all the way through to early April 39. The aircraft, the Wirraway, first flew on the 29th of March. So this is taking us all the way through. So you can see down the bottom the timeline. Joe Lyons is the Prime Minister for the whole of this time. Earl Page is the Deputy Prime Minister. Menzies is the Attorney General and also the Minister for Industry. And Archdale Parkhill was the Defence Minister at the start of this exercise. But unfortunately, in the November 1937 election, he lost his seat, the seat of Warringah, famous for another politician who held that seat as Prime Minister, Mr. Tony, a good friend. And then Harold Thorby came in, and he took over as Defence Minister halfway through the exercise here. So what are these events here? There's a lot of spikes and peaks going on in these newspaper articles. This is the count of articles by each day. So there was a whole bunch of articles around between January 37 and all through January 37. And this was the controversy over the selection of an American design, the fact that why hadn't it been a British design, and what was going on, and who chose an American design, and what was the American influence in CAC by General Motors driving this. So there's all sorts of stuff going on at that period. The next little spike, there are a couple of little spikes. Parkhill goes across to London to attend the Imperial Conference, the 1937 Imperial Conference. There's also a coronation at that time. And then the first of the 2 fly-off aircraft, the NA-16 arrives, or the NA-32. That arrives in October 37. The NA-33 also arrived about 8 weeks, 7 or 8 weeks later. And then there was a decision that the Air Force had to decide which of these aircraft they were going to build, the NA-32, which had a fixed landing gear, or the NA-33, which had a retractable landing gear, as a short summary. In December 37, the selection was announced of the NA-33 to be the design that would be built as the Wirraway. Now, at the same time, and not known so well, was of course the fact that the RAF were travelling around. There was a British Purchasing Commission travelling around the US, and despite all of the controversy over Australia choosing an American design and how that was unpatriotic and unfriendly to the Empire and to the royal family, well, the RAF selected an American design for their trainer as well as their bomber aircraft in March 38. Of course, that ended up as the Harvard. Then I said, as I mentioned before, the biggest group of articles was around the labour unrest at the CAC factory between July and September 38 by the Australian Engineers Union. And then right at the end of our timeline here, we have the first flight of the Wirraway, a little peek of articles there as well. So that was an interesting sort of map of what was going on and what was generating the volume of articles, but it still didn't help me understand what was driving the articles and where they were coming from. So if you take the same data and then you map it according to which articles are positive or neutral or negative, this is the look that you get. And again, that doesn't really tell me anything. But if I then tagged, of course, I had all of these articles tagged by the newspaper. And if I looked at the Sydney Morning Herald, they were almost consistently negative all the way through. They had some, well, they had a lot of neutral articles, very few positive articles, and many, many negative articles towards the activities. And you can see it's in this early stage of the choice of an American design and the arrival of the NA-16 aircraft. If I then looked at the Melbourne Age, the Melbourne Herald, they were, again, a lot of neutral articles, but also a lot of positive articles and almost no negative articles. So the Herald was very, very supportive. So now I'm starting to see some trends going on in this data that started me hunting around and digging a bit deeper of what was going on. So we had a Sydney paper, very negative. We had a Melbourne paper, very positive. And of course, the headlines continued. Now, I'm talking about daily newspapers. There are also a bunch of weekly newspapers. Smith's Weekly was claiming to be a patriotic Australian publication. They were very negative towards anything that CAC was doing. Can Park Hill explain this astonishing deal? Those 40 American-type planes for the RAAF, misleading inferences in a verbal smokescreen. It's a snub to Britain. Park Hill has either been misinformed or he's got something to hide. So they didn't like his choice. More headlines, negative stuff. Again, the Sydney Morning Herald, as I mentioned, they were consistently negative. The Air Arm in Australian Defence, is imperial cooperation abandoned? So they're really questioning the whole commitment to the empire by CAC. And again, another Sydney paper, but this time supportive, the Daily Telegraph in Sydney in January 37. The RAAF is threatened by munition makers, audacious propaganda to obtain profits without regard to our welfare. The federal government must send a sharp protest to Britain. Now, who are these munitions makers that they're talking about here? Well, the munitions makers were the Society of British Aircraft Constructors, the group of companies who manufactured aircraft in the UK. Of course, they believed that if a company was set up and a factory was set up to build aircraft in Australia, it would affect their sales. They would lose sales and therefore they would lose profits. And so the Daily Telegraph was pointing out that the SBAC were driving a lot of the influence on stories about the negative side of the Wirraway and the CAC project. The Daily Telegraph, again, positive, late January 37, audacious air propaganda still goes on. The motive is to prevent manufacture here, attempts to exploit British sentiment, the audacious propaganda of certain British munitions makers, or I could read that and say the audacious propaganda of the SBAC to dictate the air defence policy of Australia continues to be spread in New South Wales. So this was really a ding-dong match that was going on here between those papers that were listening and supporting the SBAC versus those papers that wanted to see an Aussie company succeed. Now, one of the big movers behind CAC that most people don't talk about a lot was William Sidney Robinson, or Bill. Bill Robinson, he was one of the senior executives inside the Colin's House Group. And he got pretty fed up with all of this. And he wrote to Sir Colin Fraser, who's one of the board members of Broken Hill Proprietary. So these are two companies that are shareholders in CAC. And Bill says to Colin, the minister might suggest that the Fairfax family would care to take on the business. we only took it on to meet a national emergency, and no one else was prepared. No one else was prepared to face. Apparently, Fairfax, Doyle, and Beecham's Pills want the business. If they can do it, let them have it. So he was really cheesed off. He was, you know, these are fighting words that he's written to Sir Colin. And this was in a file of correspondence that was shown to the Defence Department at the time. So Shepherd, who was the Secretary of the Department of Defence, Malcolm Shepherd. So there's a lot going on, and Robinson and Fraser are very heavy political operators. Robinson was friendly with not only the Australian Prime Minister, but also with Churchill and with the US president at the time, and he was friendly with the head of General Motors. He was a pal of Donald Douglas. He financed Arthur Whittle to build his jet engine. So this guy is a real influencer in the industry that most people don't really understand his role. It's fascinating to read his biography. So I was still not finding the answer that I was looking for. I was trying to find what was driving this newspaper war. So it was clear that there was a group of newspapers that were constantly supportive of CAC and the Wirraway venture. So newspapers like the Herald, the News, the Advertiser, the West Australian, they're either neutral or positive, whereas other newspapers and weeklies were constantly critical of the venture. So clearly the Sydney Morning Herald sat in that camp. So I thought, well, maybe the ownership of these newspapers can tell me something here. So who owned these newspapers? Well, of course, the Herald and the Advertiser and the West Australian were owned by the Herald and Weekly Times Group. The News was owned by News Limited. And the Sydney Morning Herald was owned by John Fairfax and Sons. Now, that's not unexpected. That's just newspapers being owned by bigger groups of newspapers. So that really doesn't tell us much about what's driving this. So then I asked the question, who owned the owners? Well, John Fairfax was a private family-held company, so they didn't have any owners. But the HWT and News, they were owned by the Collins House Group. So this was a bit of an aha for me, because as I've said before, in the files, it's pretty clear that the Collins House Group is, and through Bill Robinson, is a name that's got a link to this whole CAC activity. So Collins House owns the Electrolytic Zinc Company, and they own Broken Hill Associated Smelters. And that's a connection with CAC. Those are two of the shareholders when CAC were formed. There's 6 companies that own shares in CAC when they were first formed. BHP, ICI, Australia and New Zealand, GMH, the Orient Steam Navigation Company, EZ and BHAS. So the Collins House Group, who owned the Herald and Weekly Times Group and who owned the News Limited Group, also were one of the shareholders of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation. So it's now pretty clear that once you understand that ownership structure, what's going on here is actually an orchestrated publicity campaign through friendly newspapers. So Collins House owned CAC, they owned these newspapers, they didn't want to see CAC taken down in the newspapers, so they got behind them and made sure that friendly stories and positive stories were published through the in-house newspapers. So of course you have to, you have to be a bit cynical about newspapers because they just tell what their owners want them to tell, and this is pretty clear when you see this analysis. A lot of this is actually told, a lot of this I had kind of suspected, but hadn't really got it confirmed until I read this book by Sally Young. This was published about 2 years ago, Paper Emperors. And it really is fascinating. It's a wonderful read. And just to understand the growth of the newspapers in the early, between about 1880 and 1950, it's very interesting reading. Collins House Group not only owned the newspapers, they also owned newsprint mills to make the papers themselves. So they had all sorts of businesses linked together in the Collins House Group. They don't exist anymore, so we don't really understand the power that that group held in pre-war Australia. They were one of Australia's largest industrial and conglomerates. So now we think we understand what's driving the newspaper war. What was going on in the magazines? Well, there were 3 significant industry journals at the time, well, I'll suggest in Australia: the Aeroplane, Flight and Aircraft. So the Aeroplane and Flight both came out of London, of course. The Aircraft magazine was an Australian journal. The Aeroplane and Flight both covered Australian content. They had a lot of Australian news stories. Generally, they had a couple of pages on Australian news in every edition because, of course, Australia was a Pacific Dominion, so they covered all of the empire. And what were these journals talking about? Well, Aircraft magazine, of course, took a lot of advertising from CAC. So you would expect them to provide positive views of the story, not only from CAC, but also all of CAC's suppliers, which was a massive network. There were about 150 companies that supplied components to CAC to build the Wirraway. On the other hand, the Aeroplane and Flight, they did cover Australian news, as I said, but of course they were funded by the SBAC. So all of their advertising came from SBAC members, and they saw themselves as the voice of the SBAC. In particular, Charles Grey, who I mentioned before, who was the editor of the Aeroplane. Now, Charles Grey would, of course, espouse his views very, very directly. He saw himself as the self-appointed mouthpiece of the SBAC, and he would ferment his views through his editorial content. And there were 6 editorials that were directly related to what was going on related to CAC and the Wirraway. Grey had been consistently negative towards Lawrence Wackett prior to this time, and he continued this negative attitude towards CAC and the Wirraway because not only was it an American design, but because it had Wackett related to the story. And the type of stuff that he would be putting out there, this is from his editorial 17th of February 37. He says here, in any case, the decision to build an American machine is a gross breach of faith with the British Air Ministry, with whom an agreement had been made that the equipment of the RAAF and the RAF should be identical, so that cooperation in war should be easier. Now, he's partly true, but he's partly not true either, because the 1937 Empire Conference did allow differences in aircraft. It's a little known fact. So he's not quite correct to state that there was an agreement that the equipment of the RAAF and the RAF should be identical. He says that we believe that little manufacturing in the sense of handicraft is to be done at Fisherman's Bend. So he's implying that these will be aircraft parts shipped from America and assembled at Fisherman's Bend. Here's another editorial, 17th of November now. Fisherman's Bend. Early in December, the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation Limited is to start production of American NA-16 two-seat fighters. The prospects of the company, as far as any more orders for American machines are concerned, are seriously affected by the fact that the former Minister of Defence, Sir Archdale Parkhill, who was responsible for awarding the contract, has been thrown out by the electors of Warringah. Now, he had some interesting insight, of course, because he believed that the choice of an American aircraft was driven by Parkhill in cahoots with Wackett. And so he believed that once Parkhill was gone, no longer would Australia choose American aircraft. And to a certain extent, he was right, because the whole exercise that then followed was the hastily patched together plan to build the Beaufort. But he wasn't entirely right, because Wackett ended up having his day, and we know that as the war started and the English factories had to support the war in Europe, Australia pretty quickly had to turn to the US for actual supply of any aircraft on an ongoing basis. Again, Grey in December 37, Australian News. The first NA-16 to be seen in Australia was inspected at Sydney a few weeks ago. He says the machine did not excite much comment, and the pilots who have handled it are not impressed by its performance in bad weather, when it is apt to do many things which it should not. So he's actually pretty critical, and this actually prompted a bit of a investigation by Dickie Williams, the Air Chief Marshal of the RAAF. And Williams actually had to go and talk to the pilots who had flown the aircraft up to this date and find out if they had been speaking to the press and if they had been telling him this. And in actual fact, that was not the case. The pilots who had been flying the first NA-16 And it was only a small number of pilots because not many pilots had been checked out on the aircraft. So this was essentially a made-up story that Grey had been promulgating here. Now, the aircraft magazine, as I've said, they were consistently positive. This is of course, they ran front covers featuring Wirraways for quite a few months in a row. Multiple covers sponsored by Commonwealth Aircraft, of course. So the front cover there is just a big ad, and then content inside the magazine was always very positive. So this is an article about an air pageant that was held at Richmond in early 1938, and there's pictures of the NA-16 and the NA-33 with glowing comments about them if you read the text. And then once more, just one more, not quite the last one, but another comment by Grey. As regular readers of the aeroplane are well aware, Professor Wackett's organisation in the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation is a rather hybrid concern. It calls itself an Australian company, although much of the capital is American, and it is to build American machines and is staffed by American experts. So again, he's being a little bit incendiary there because the company only had 10% capital from General Motors Holdings, which was not fully owned by the US. So he's talking about a small amount of capital, although he describes it as much capital. And of course, they did have American experts. Probably 4 American experts came across for the engines and the airframes, but that's hardly staffing the company by American experts. So we get towards the end of this saga. The first flight of the Wirraway, 27th of March, 1939. The Melbourne Herald, of course, owned by Colin's house. They're very positive. Page 1, first Wirraway in successful tests. They've got a nice little paragraph there, and then you turn the page, and there on page 3 is the photograph of the Wirraway coming into land on its first test flight. The Sydney Morning Herald, of course, they still couldn't quite come to celebrate the fact that an Australian-built aeroplane had given its first test flight, so they buried the picture away on page 12. And of course, Grey was going to make a comment. April 39 editorial, the Wirraway flies. Readers who have followed the vicissitudes of the Wacket wonder known as the Wirraway are already relieved to know that it has flown. Flight Lieutenant H. Boss Walker was the pilot. He managed to get into the air after a run of approximately 400 yards. He did not attempt to do any tricks, and nothing seriously will be attempted until the RAAF is asked to put it through its acceptance tests. These probably will be merciful. So he's skeptical to the last. He wasn't going to give an inch even after Australia had successfully built and flown an aircraft of this complexity. Anyway, so we're looking back on the history. We know the story had a happy ending. Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation built 755 Wirraways. We saw thousands of pilots trained on these aircraft. And of course, the British followed our lead and ordered the Harvard. So just to summarize, the newspaper war that erupted following the selection of an American design for production in Australia was an orchestrated campaign to generate public patriotic support for a controversial choice versus the old imperialism. And that's where I'm going to leave it. Oh, and by the way, there's a shameless plug. So I'll hand over back to you, Robert, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Typical of a whole lot of sour grapes, and it didn't only happen with the military, of course. After a certain aeroplane won a certain 1934 air race, the British were in a situation where they were really pressed to deliver aeroplanes which were up to the task. We had special dispensation to import Junkers aeroplanes, which were all metalled and didn't fall apart in New Guinea, which was the busiest airfields on the planet at the time. And the other issue that I think really comes to mind is it was interesting to Grey's comments about the American staffing. The British at that point in time were gearing up their own war efforts, and the machinery and all the other things that were required to manufacture something like a Wirraway would not have been available in England at the time. And when you look at the early photos of CAC's plant, all of the big presses are Milwaukee and good old American stock. So there really wasn't a lot, as you say, it's politics, but the reality of it was that I think the choice was obviously the right one, but for a whole lot of reasons, not just that it was a better aeroplane. It was able to be supported on a manufacturing basis as well by the Americans.
Yeah,
When
exactly.
and
Yeah,
when you look at the sad efforts, what was defending Singapore? I'll leave it at that.
yes. No, you're right, Roland. The equipment ordering, when Wackett went on his second tour to go and order the equipment and get the licenses signed, he built, you know, the equipment list based on what he learned in the North American factory. And then he telegraphed across to the UK and got the air liaison officer to find out if any of the English machine tool companies could supply those pieces of equipment. And about 3/4 of them could supply them technically, but they said the lead times would be too long. So they did end up ordering about 3/4 of their equipment from US manufacturers and only 1/4 from the UK. And it was all for practical purposes. They realized that they had to get the factory up and running and they couldn't wait for the British politics. The British, you know, they kind of saw all this coming, and in the end, the Air Ministry people were pretty supportive. So one of the things that had to happen was the British Air, because Australia was, you know, part of the empire, the British Dominion's office had to give approval for Australia to import that machinery from the US without heavy tariffs. And they did, in fact, go ahead and give that approval very quickly because they knew that they couldn't slow this thing down.
Derek, Colin Campbell from the New South Wales AHSA, and also ex-volunteer with Tom Lockley at the Aviation Museum at Bankstown. About 8 years ago, we had a open day over there, and I collect cutaway drawings. I had about 12 folders laid out on the table, all opened up, and this elderly lady came up and she started leafing through the drawings, and I'm sitting there being a typical male thinking, well, she must be having a senior's moment. And I asked, is there anything I can help you with? And she said, have you got a cutaway of a Wirraway? And I looked at her and she said, yeah, I was a trained engine fitter with a RAF on them during the war. And I said, no, I haven't got a cutaway of a Wirraway. Oh, she said, have you got one of a boomerang? I've done a course on it.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of women in the WAF doing fitters. You often see pictures of you know, the whole maintenance activities being done by WAF staff.
Perhaps I can come
very
in there.
interesting talk. If we hadn't selected the Wirraway, what do people think that CAC would have built?
Well, the British were strongly pushing the Lysander as a two-seat Army cooperation aircraft as the solution to the RAAF requirement, because they were arguing that what the RAAF was looking for was a two-seat Army cooperation and general purpose aircraft. So the British were pushing incredibly hard once they heard of the choice of an American aircraft that Australia should build the Lysander.
Okay, thank you.
There was some there's some layers to that too, if I can come in. James Kitely here. Yeah, absolutely. Of course, Derek's very right in that. And although the Lysander was a Westland aircraft, it had a Bristol engine, and there was a strong connection with Bristol, with Wackett, of course. But Wackett, I understand, being rebuffed by Bristol whilst they were pledged a licence to the Czechs. They weren't at the early stages of the negotiations prepared to license to Australia. Just before I throw that back to Derek, there was another wrinkle that I believe the ferry battle was looked at as a possibility and was ruled out because it was a Merlin engine that Wackett didn't feel Australia could build at that point.
Yeah, there was a bit of animus about Bristol licensing for the Czechs. But of course, that was a big challenge that the UK had to support Czechoslovakia because they were so close to Germany, and they wanted to make sure that Czechoslovakia was on their side. So it was a big political decision to support Czechoslovakia versus not against Australia, but that's why that deal ended up happening. And the ferry battle, I never saw any real interest. Wackett went and saw the ferry battle. He saw it fly. It was a 3-man aircraft, and it had a water-cooled engine, so it didn't fit the spec because they were looking for a 2-man aircraft with a radial engine. I think Wackett he would have loved to have built the Spitfire as well, but of course he knew pragmatically that there was not a chance that you would try to build something that complex as the first aircraft in your assembly line. So he was very pragmatic. He loved the technology. There's a lot of comments, of course, about his tours around the UK. That's another whole story. We've got the diary that was kept of the 6 weeks of visiting different aircraft factories and material suppliers in the UK. So he was enthralled by a lot of the stuff that was going on. The other aircraft that would have filled the bill, of course, was the Bristol Type 138, I think it was, which was basically a British design of the Wirraway. It was a low wing, radial engine, 2-seat aircraft. It was designed to the same spec as the Lysander, but it never went into production.
Yeah, when we had the talk on the DC2 a while ago, it reminded me of Lawrence Wackett's autobiography, and it's the most common word in that, by the way, is I. But he went to with a group of industrialists to see the DC2, and that he says that's how CAC got formed. And he says that he authorised the check for 10,000 in to kick CAC off, and then got into trouble with Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors because of getting involved in local affairs and getting involved in aircraft, because General Motors had recently bought Fokker and gone, and that hadn't worked out financially. Anyway, so Wackett says it was a bit grim when they started criticising General Motors because CAC had chosen an American aircraft, because he said he had nothing to do with it. And anyway, the story is quite long and involved, but in the end, the holding of Holden was restricted to below 10%, and the fact that he'd defied Alfred P. Sloan was sort of the break in the relationship of Hartnett with Holden. It's quite an interesting story, and this rounds it out beautifully, and it was well done. Thanks very much. I love the statistics. It really pointed it out. Thanks, Derek.
You're welcome, Tom. And the Alfred P. Sloan connection is an interesting one, because 2 weeks before Hartnett raised this idea of supporting aircraft production in Australia via his boss in New York to Sloan, Sloan had actually met with Bill Robinson. So Bill Robinson, W.S. Robinson, was all around the place. So he personally knew Albert Sloan, and he had said, we're going to be looking for some support from you guys, because I believe that the American model is a better model to follow than the British model for aircraft manufacturing. So when Hartnett's boss brought it up with Sloan, Sloan knew about it, and it was a different response from Sloan versus what Hartnett wrote in his book.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, when the Spitfires did arrive, they weren't exactly a great success because of their range and, lack of ruggedness in comparison to the Kitty Hawks and things like that. It wouldn't have done Australia a lot of good to have had Spitfires or Hurricanes at the time with a range of only 50 or 100 miles, a combat range of only 50 or 100 miles.
Interesting timing, but just last Saturday, I was in a Wirraway. Ross Parker's Mike Fox up at Watts Bridge, and I was having a good long look at everything in the cockpit, and I noticed the airspeed indicator was calibrated up to 260 knots, at which there was a red line, no numbers beyond that. And as I glanced around, there was a placard stating various speed limits for the aeroplane. included was V&E 300, or it might have been 305, but it was definitely 300 or 305. And I thought, this is silly, you know. I know, it just occurred to me now that perhaps that is an old placard deliberately left there, and that perhaps was in miles per hour.
Ross Parker's actually logged on to this talk.
Yeah, Ross would know. Ross is sitting there waving. Hi, how are you, Ross?
Yeah, Ross, what's it got on the 300? Is that miles per hour?
You need to unmute yourself, Ross.
No, you're still muted, Ross.
Yes, I'm unmuted now. Thank you. I'm very pleased to be invited to tonight's discussion. And Derek, it's fantastic to get your details. Derek and I, as a bit of history, we're at two ends of a very long string. I've got an aeroplane and he's got all the knowledge about the history of it. There are only 3 Wirraways left flying, as some of you may know, and I have been the proud owner and pilot of 695 behind me for over 25 years. Which is available for all of you to come and see us in Caboolture and go flying in, by the way. So you can be part of modern history as well as past. To answer Warwick's question, as I understand it, and the guru of Derek may well be able to either cross-examine or disagree, but the 695 being part of the last of the production line is the Mark III, and as I understand it, they had strengthened wing spars which allowed them to have a higher V&E, higher top speed than the earlier Mark Is. So the placard is in fact correct, Warwick, but I suspect it is an old ASI. What I would also tell you is that anytime you take it above 260 or 280 knots, it is a braver man than I. I do displays, low-level aerobatic displays and flypasts and so on in aircraft. So I take it to its limits, but not to that limit, let's say. Does that answer your question, Warwick?
That's beautiful.
Warwick, did you enjoy the ride?
No,
ladies and gentlemen, I'm here tonight simply to give any contribution that I may be able to assist Derek or any of you in your questions about Wirraway. As I say, I've flown it for over 500-600 hours. It is a delightful aeroplane in many ways and an absolute nightmare in others. If anyone would like some information on the aircraft itself as we speak, as it flies, I'm happy to speak on that, but I don't want to steal Derek's thunder for the wonderful presentation he's done this evening. Thank you, Derek.
No, that's great, Russ. I appreciate the thoughts and the comments, and you're one of my heroes for actually owning and operating and maintaining one of these beautiful old planes.
Ross, how many aircraft are flying in Australia at the moment?
The Wirraway's only 3. Ours is in Caboolture in Queensland, the only one there. There is one owned by Paul Bennett in Cessnock, and the Temora Aviation Museum operates the other one. I believe that Paul's and ours are the only 2 available for adventure flights, or personal flights, private flights, which any of you could join in. At the moment, I think the museum at Temora has pretty tight reins on its machine. So if you want to see living, breathing history, 695 is there.
Yeah. So I think Ross, once Anastasia's changed her mind, we'll be all up and knocking at your door.
Well, yes, when she's changed her mind, I'll be crossing the border myself. There's much that we have to do. The airplane is actually quite busy. I'm retired now, so I have a lot of time to fly it, and we are getting out and about to a lot of places with the aircraft, not just Watts Bridge over the hill, but it is engaged in a lot of different work. The last big event was the RAAF Edinburgh show in November last year. It was supposed to be part of 2021's Air Force event, but we're expecting 2021 to be a bumper year for air shows because everything has been pushed back because of COVID into the next year. And I'm really hoping that the aircraft is going to be all over the eastern seaboard on various displays.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And Ross, I believe now that the Temora aircraft has actually been handed back to ownership by the Air Force. So the Air Force owns one now.
The entire collection has actually been handed back to the Air Force.
Yeah.
So yes, you could say that it's gone back to its original hands.
There's also another flying Wirraway in Australia. It's I don't know if it's still being flown, but it was flown into NIL, into the NIL Aviation Heritage Centre in Victoria about a year or two ago.
Yeah, you're quite right, Gordon. There's two other airworthy Wirraways, but they're owned by museums, and so they're not flown.
That's
Yes,
right.
I'm not sure if they're flown or not.
If I may, it's 722 at NIL, and it belonged to Borg Sorensen. It is an immaculate aircraft. It's absolutely glorious to look at. And if anyone's passing NIL, do not go past that museum. He babied that thing and he built it over more than 2 decades. And it is in fantastic condition. In fact, in 2019, just last year, I think the week before the Edinburgh Air Show, I used 695 in a demonstration at NIL itself, and I got to see that aircraft for the first time myself. It's fantastic. The other one is 652, which was flown into Caloundra, the Queensland Air Museum. But both of those aircraft have been donated to those museums on the agreement that they never be flown again.
There's one at Ballarat, I think, too. Yes, in fact, there is. It's quite a nice looking one. When we did the mail run in 2014, I got a ride in the Wirraway from Albury to Mora, and it was just the experience of a lifetime in the back seat. The sort of all the control wires were beneath in the cavernous fuselage. We actually carried the mail in that aircraft, and Andrew, the pilot, spent about 10 minutes tying everything down because of the possibility of something moving and fouling one of the exposed control lines. But it was the experience of a lifetime.
Hello, Charles Page from Perth. I was just speaking to one of our World War II veterans who's since died, and I asked him what was his favourite aircraft. He said the Mustang and maybe the Tempest, and what was the one he found hardest to fly, and he said it was definitely the Wirraway. If you could fly a Wirraway, you could fly anything. And also on the construction of the Wirraway, we lost one of our air cadets in the A2679. He was doing a dive bombing practice out of Laverton, I think, at Werribee. And he got down pretty low, pulled out in the rolling turn, and the wing came off. And of course, it went straight in. It was found later that the leading edge ribs were connected to the wing skin by cleats rather than rivets, and it was thought that this might have contributed to the loss of the wing. Have you heard anything about that?
Oh, I have, yes, Charles. There's an extensive accident report written on that crash, and the whole idea of doing a rolling pullout from a dive bombing run. There's no cleats, there's rivets on the leading edge, so that's not the case. What they discovered was that the maneuver of doing a rolling pullout, so you've been diving at about 45 degrees and then you pull the nose up, and so of course that creates a G load, but then if you at the same time roll the aircraft to the side, that puts an additional load on the upward moving wing. So you're not only loading the upward moving wing with the G's of the pullout, it's the rolling maneuver. So basically that overstressed the structure. And that wasn't the first Wirraway to lose a wing in that maneuver. In fact, the Wirraways were losing their wings, or the center section was collapsing. I should be careful. They didn't lose the outer wing. The center section collapsed by overstressing in that maneuver. And as part of the accident investigation of that crash, they put a G meter on another Wirraway and simulated the same maneuver. And they came down and they looked at the aircraft after the testing, and that aircraft had popped several rivets in the center section, but it had not actually overstressed. So they then put a G limit on the Wirraways for flight this was about 1952, maybe, I think, it was in the 50s. And they put a G limit on maneuvers, and they stopped pilots from doing rolling pullouts from a dive bombing exercise.
Yeah, that probably saved a few more lives. Thank you.
Yeah. But there's a big extensive report on that accident.
Mm-hmm.
But I know of about at least 5 Wirraways that unexplained had the center section collapse on them via RAAF crash reports.
So a weakness there in the center section then, was it?
Yeah, you could overstress it, yes.
Yeah.
It wasn't a weakness, it was just if you took it beyond its limits.
Not really, gentlemen. What happens is that in the design of aircraft, they take into account the anticipated utilisation, the anticipated loads. Yeah. And the fore and aft G limits are what they expect in the main. But they can't quantify the lateral G. And in those days, without computers, you couldn't combine lateral G and the fore and aft G to come up with the stresses that were going to be on the metallurgy at the time. So there were limits all the way around. And what you're doing with, as Derek has described, pulling up this way, the aircraft is designed for that. And you can do all sorts of testing. And even though in those days they had a pretty good understanding of metallurgy, you just look at the Pratt & Whitney engine, a very robust and strong engine. But if you took it outside its limits, it didn't last long. Believe me, one of mine didn't last long. But not because I took it outside of limits. But in terms of the airframe, they're looking at pretty defined and pretty clinical G loadings and directional loadings. But if you add the twisting, the lateral G, we're talking rolling G, it's known as rolling G, you add that extra dimension, and they just didn't know how to build structures and they didn't brace it in those sort of terms. They braced it for fore and aft G, but not for side loads like that at the same time as fore and aft. So rolling G. In fact, rolling G was a limitation that went on for decades and decades after that. Even some modern aircraft still have no rolling G allowed. Thank you.
Warwick again, just to stop any misconceptions. No, I didn't get to fly in the Wirraway. I just had a good look at it on the ground. But I landed in parallel to them. They've now got parallel runways at Watts Bridge. I was arriving at an RB6 on Wirraway on final beside me.
Warwick, come fly. Just give me a call. Give me a call.
There's an invitation for you, Warwick.
Can I come in?
Yes.
Can I just come in? I've just made some notes here. James Kiteley again, and thanks, Derek. I don't think I said last time. Great presentation. Good summary. C.G. Grey, I love to rant about him as he loved to rant about everything else. He compared Russians to monkeys, and he was pretty out there even by the standards of the era. It's worth reading his comparison of how wonderful the HP-42 was as a superior aircraft to the rather second-rate DC-2 as far as he was concerned. So he never let, as Derek beautifully demonstrated, never let any facts stand in the way of what he wanted to say. And he's certainly very problematic as an editor of a major magazine. But just to take in a slightly different direction, I don't know if you explored this, Derek, but we do know what might have happened had Australia bought British to a degree, because if we look at Canada, they are very much in a similar position. So just very quickly, they built the Supermarine Stranraer as a licensed production with Bristol engines. And then into World War II, of course, they built both Hurricanes and Lysanders, which brings us back to that earlier point. But the interesting thing about the Hurricanes and the Lysanders, and I think also the Stranraers, is they had to wait for the engines from the UK. So had we gone that route, which is a lot of ifs and so on, of course, then we would probably have had an awful lot of aircraft X with waiting on British engines, because they would have, and doubly so, of course, if we'd have been after the same engines the Canadians were after, because it would have been the same sort of level of problem. And taking a slightly different direction, they weren't looking at an actual trainer, as Derek really well pointed out. It was a two-seat radial engine, and really a kind of imperial policing or multi-role aircraft. So that's where the Lysander makes some sense. It would have been a terrible, terrible training aircraft. They had two dual control Lysanders built because they lost a number in the early days in the UK. But had we gone with a training aircraft, it would probably have been the Miles Kestrel, later the Miles Master. And one of the interesting things not a lot of people are aware of is that was a wooden airframe. I think everyone would know that. But they were used in Africa, in I think either South Africa or I think actually Rhodesia. And some of them were lost due to desiccation of the wooden airframe and structural failure as a consequence. So even that route would have potentially been problematic in certainly Victoria, New South Wales, and so on. So it's interesting to follow that through. My question, Derek, I don't know if you've had a chance at all, but would be to look at the Canadian media about their struggles with trying to get production from Britain into Canada, very similar to here, and how that ran. Have you ever managed to look at that?
I haven't specifically, but I was aware of the Canadian link because one of the early chapters of my book, I discuss, or I go through the history of aircraft manufacturing and the air defence policies between the wars. And South Africa also followed a similar route, putting licence-built British aircraft into production in Pretoria. So the South Africans and the Canadians, being the other dominions, they kind of knuckled down and went with the licence-built approach, following the British manufacturers. I guess the other thing that could have happened as well, not only when an American design was chosen, the British suggested the Lysander, so that was in I forget the date, around early 37. But before that, of course, the British were trying to kick out General Motors and GM from the shareholding, and so of course they proposed that Hawker Siddeley come in and take the shareholding that was held by General Motors Holden. So that could have also been a very different route to follow as well. We would have ended up, making more Demons or more Hearts, or maybe a Hurricane or two.
We've got a couple of minutes left. If there's any more questions or discussion. Look, I'll take the opportunity at this point in time to thank you, Derek. It's been a fascinating journey you've taken us through tonight. I enjoyed the political intrigue, of course, but in reality, it was the start of CAC, a company that has served us very well over many, many years. Your overall picture covered a lot of things, the politics, newspaper ownership, and basically follow the money trail, and you can see who's doing what. But certainly another example of Melbourne against Sydney, perhaps, as well. Overall, Derek, most enjoyable. Thank you very much, and please thank Derek. Okay, I'm not